We had been planning the camping trip for months, and everyone in our friend group was excited about finally getting away from the noise and chaos of the city to spend a weekend in the wilderness of the Blackwood Forest, just 2 hours north of town. The old hiking trail that led into the heart of the forest was supposed to be one of the most beautiful in the entire region, with pristine lakes and dense woodlands that made you feel like you had traveled back in time to when the world was still untamed and wild. 5 of us decided to make the journey that cool September weekend when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the nights were growing longer than the days. Marcus had found the camping spot online in some obscure outdoors forum, and he kept telling us how lucky we were to get the exact coordinates, because apparently very few people knew about this particular area deep in the forest. It was secluded, he said, which was exactly what we wanted, to get away from civilization and experience nature in its rawest, most authentic form. The drive up took longer than expected because the roads became increasingly narrow and winding as we climbed higher into the mountains, and the cell service disappeared completely about 30 minutes before we finally arrived at the trailhead. When we parked the car and got out, I remember feeling a strange chill that had nothing to do with the temperature around us. The forest seemed to press in from all sides, with towering pine and oak trees, creating a canopy so thick that even in the afternoon, the sunlight struggled to penetrate down to the forest floor. The air smelled different up here, with a sharp pine scent mixed with something else, something almost metallic that I couldn't quite place. Sarah, my girlfriend, wrinkled her nose and said she smelled something rotten, like a dead animal somewhere nearby, but Marcus dismissed her concerns, saying it was just a natural smell of the forest and that we would get used to it soon enough. The hike to the campsite took about an hour, and as we walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice that the forest seemed unusually quiet. There were no birds singing, no squirrels chattering in the trees, no sounds of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Just our footsteps on the path and the sound of our own breathing. The trees seemed to get taller and older as we progressed, and some of them were so massive that 4 people holding hands could not have wrapped their arms around the trunk. The bark on many of the oldest trees was deeply scarred, with what looked like deliberate markings carved deep into the wood in patterns that seemed almost like symbols or warnings. When we finally reached the clearing where we would set up camp, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, because at least in the open area, the oppressive feeling of the forest pressing down on us from all sides diminished somewhat. The clearing was perfectly circular, almost unnaturally so, with a clear stream running along one edge and a natural fire pit area in the center. The ground was covered in soft moss, and there were several large boulders scattered around that would serve as good places to sit and rest. Marcus started setting up the large tent while the rest of us gathered firewood and prepared the camp. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows were growing longer and deeper as we worked. Golden light filtered through the trees at odd angles, creating strange patterns that seemed to move and shift when you weren't looking directly at them. By the time we had finished setting everything up and getting the fire going, it was almost completely dark, and the forest around us had become a wall of impenetrable blackness that the light from our fire seemed unable to penetrate beyond a few feet. We sat around the fire and made dinner on a portable camping stove and ate while watching the flames dance and flicker. As night deepened, the cold became more intense than any of us had anticipated, and we found ourselves huddling closer to the fire for warmth. Even though we had all brought thick jackets and sweaters, there was something about the cold that seemed to penetrate through the fabric, as if it were coming from inside the earth itself, rather than from the air around us. Around midnight, after we had finished eating and cleaned up the mess, Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm and asked if I had heard that sound. I told her I hadn't heard anything, but then she pointed into the darkness beyond the fire and said that there was definitely something out there, something large moving through the brush. I listened carefully, and then I heard it too, a low sound like something heavy pushing through the vegetation. Maybe a deer or an elk, we told her,
trying to sound confident. Marcus said that large animals typically avoided humans and that we had nothing to worry about, but I noticed that he kept his eyes on the darkness just beyond the firelight and that his hand was resting on the large knife he kept clipped to his belt. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and sleep was difficult to find, even after we had climbed into our sleeping bags inside the tent. We lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest around us, and every small noise seemed amplified and somehow menacing. I must have finally drifted off sometime in the early morning hours because I woke suddenly to find that it was dawn and gray light was filtering in through the tent walls. Over breakfast, we discussed what we had heard during the night, and there was an underlying tension in our conversation that hadn't been there before. Everyone acknowledged that something large had been moving around in the darkness near our camp. The question was what? Sarah suggested it might be a bear, but Marcus said that bears rarely came this close to human encampments, and that if one had been nearby, it would have been attracted to the smell of our food. We had been careful to store everything properly in bear canisters, but still the thought that a bear might have been nearby watching us was unsettling. The second day of our camping trip, we decided to explore the area and hike to a nearby lake that was supposedly one of the most beautiful in the entire forest region. The hike was about 2 hours round trip, and everyone agreed that it would be good to get moving and perhaps shake off some of the uneasiness that had settled over the group. We packed some snacks and water and set out on the trail. The forest seemed different in daylight, but not necessarily better. The trees still felt oppressive, and the lack of animal sounds was still deeply disturbing. As we hiked, we passed several more of those strange carved symbols on the trunks of old trees. The markings seemed intentional and deliberate, and the grooves were so deep that they looked ancient, as if they had been carved decades or centuries ago. When I asked Marcus what they meant, he said they were probably just old trail markings or maybe carvings made by previous hikers, but his tone suggested that he didn't quite believe that himself. When we finally reached the clearing, we reached Lake Evergreen in late morning, and it was indeed spectacular. The water was so clear that you could see down to the rocky bottom, and the surrounding mountains were reflected in the glass-smooth surface with pristine clarity. The air seemed fresher here, and there was even some wildlife visible. We saw a deer drinking from the lake at a distance, and some birds were actually flying overhead. The lake seemed to exist in a pocket of normalcy that was completely separate from the oppressive feeling of the rest of the forest. We spent an hour at the lake, and then Sarah suggested we should head back to camp because the day was growing late and she didn't want to be hiking through the forest at dusk. On the way back, no one spoke much, and we all seemed eager to return to the relative safety of our camp. When we arrived back at the clearing, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were large claw marks on several of the trees at the edge of the clearing, marks that definitely had not been there when we left that morning. The claw marks were fresh, and they were deep gouges that suggested something with enormous claws and tremendous strength had raked its nails across the bark. The marks were also high up on the trees, much higher than even a grizzly bear could reach while standing on its hind legs. Marcus examined the marks closely, and his face had gone pale. He said nothing at first, but just stared at the marks for several minutes. Finally, he said that we should probably pack up our camp and head back to the car before we had a few more hours of daylight left. No one argued with him. We began the process of breaking down our campsite and packing our gear with increasing urgency as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. We were almost finished packing when we heard a sound that froze us all in place. It was a call of some kind, an eerie wailing sound that seemed to come from deep in the forest beyond the trees surrounding our clearing. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't quite a howl, and it wasn't quite a scream, but rather something that seemed to combine elements of both sounds with a strange harmonic quality that made my hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Sarah was shaking, and she grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it hurt. She whispered that we needed to leave right now, that something was seriously wrong, and that we should not be out in this forest when darkness fell. I wanted to argue that we were probably overreacting, that there was likely a reasonable explanation for everything we had heard and seen, but the truth was I was terrified too. The forest around us suddenly felt deeply wrong, as if the very air had become toxic with malevolent intent. We finished packing in frantic haste, throwing things into backpacks without any care for organization, and then we began